Thank you. Thanks. Right. Thanks, yeah.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Plumbing Employer webinar. My name is Kate Yates. Thank you for joining. Leslie, shall we move to the next slide? Today, we're going to talk about the changes that we'd like to make to the scheme's governance arrangements. And over the next hour or so, we'll tell you what we're planning to do and answer any questions that you might have. The important message and takeaway from today is that none of the changes that we're planning to make are going to affect the benefits that you or your employees have built up in the scheme. So let me introduce our panel of speakers today. We have John Bridger, Chair of the Trustee Board, Fiona Hodgson, CEO of the Scottish and Northern Ireland Plumbing Employers Federation, John Thompson, CEO of the Association of Plumbing and Heating Contractors, John Neal, Pensions Officer at Unite, and myself, Kate Yates, CEO for the admin company. Let's begin with some housekeeping. We have received a few questions in advance, but if you think of a question as we go through the webinar, you can send it to us using the question mark speech bubble at the top of your screen. There'll be plenty of time for questions at the end. We know you're all busy people, so we will try and keep the webinar to an hour, but we do want to answer as many of your questions as we can, so we might go over the hour by a little bit. If your question relates to your own personal or business circumstances, then we'll contact you outside the webinar. We won't deal with it in the webinar. We are recording the webinar today so that you can watch it again, and you'll find the recording in the employer portal. If you haven't already registered to use the employer portal, it's easy to do. Just go to our website after the event, www.plumbingpensions.co.uk. So without further ado, let me hand over to John Bridger, who will explain why we felt we needed to review the scheme's governance structure and what the changes mean for the trustee board going forwards. Over to you, John.
Thank you, Kate, and hello, everybody. As Kate says, I'm going to explain why we need to change the governance structure and the process we're going through to make those changes. I will then talk in a bit more detail about the proposed changes to the trustee board, and then I'll hand over to John Thompson of APHC to talk about employer representation. You'll all have seen from the consultation documents that the governance review covers three main areas: the trustee board, how employers are represented, and the administration company. Each of these areas requires modernisation and reform, and perhaps I can illustrate this by way of examples in each case. The trustee board has already recognised the need for more professional expertise on the board, and I was appointed as an independent professional trustee in 2017. Up until that point, Alan Pickering had been the sole independent professional trustee and long-standing chair of the trustee board. However, the trustee company has historically been established on the basis that the independent directors were not permitted any voting rights. This is a very unusual situation and out of step with how pension schemes typically operate in the 21st century. As far as employer representation is concerned, there is currently no single body representing the interests of employers. We have two trade bodies, SNPEF and APHC, but not all employers are members of these trade bodies. All pension schemes require the trustee board and the employer, or employers, in the case of multi-employer schemes such as this one, to work very closely together. In some cases, decisions will require the agreement of the trustee board and the employers, and in other cases, the trustee board will just need to consult with employers. But either way, there needs to be a very clear line of communication between the trustee board and the employers. And at the moment, this line of communication does not exist. We currently work around that by communicating with the trade bodies on a regular basis and then writing to all employers on various matters such as scheme funding and investment strategy. This is okay as far as it goes, but it's not the most streamlined and efficient process, and arguably not very effective in terms of employer decision making. The third area relates to the administration company, which is the organisation that employs staff to carry out the day-to-day administration of the pension scheme, such as calculating members' benefits at retirement and paying pensions on a monthly basis. The administration company doesn't have any assets or income of its own, and so it relies on the trustee company for funding. Essentially, the administration company provides a service and the trustee company pays for that service. However, another historical legacy is that the directors of the administration company are the same as the directors of the trustee company, which is not ideal from a governance perspective. So I think it's fair to say that everyone involved in running the pension scheme recognised the problems caused by these issues and the need for change. This view is also shared by the pensions regulator, and so in the summer of 2020, the three constituent organisations who had originally set up the pension scheme, SNPEF, APHC and Unite the Union, together with the trustee board, agreed to undertake a governance review. The first step in this process was to appoint an independent third-party PI consultants to review the existing structure. I emphasised at the time that this represented the start of the process rather than the end of the process, although to be honest, I still underestimated quite how long this process would take. This was primarily due to the sheer scope of the project. I think there were about 50 specific recommendations, and also the fact that 4 parties, SNPF, APHC, Unite and the Trustee Board, needed to reach agreement on all of these issues. All of these parties met individually and collectively on a regular basis throughout this period, and whilst there were no major disagreements, it still took 12 months of very hard work to get to where we are today. So in terms of the proposed changes, let's look at the Trustee Board first. The scheme is currently managed by the trustee company, Plumbing Pensions UK Limited, which is responsible for paying members' benefits, investing the scheme's assets, and if required, collecting contributions. We plan to reduce the size of the Trustee Board from 9 to 7 directors. 2 directors will be chosen by employers. 2 directors will be chosen by the union, and 3 independent directors will be appointed. All the directors will be appointed for 4-year terms. This ties in with a 3 to 4 year cycle that a pension scheme runs on. Every director will have equal voting rights, and directors will be paid a market rate for their role and responsibilities. Now I'm going to hand over to John Thompson to explain how employers will be represented under the new structure going forwards.
Thanks, John, for that introduction. What I'd like to do is to take us through one of the significant areas around change that's in the actual proposal, and that's around the area of employer representation. I'll do this presentation session on behalf of the 2 constituent bodies, that's APHC and SNPF, and Fiona will be joining us for the question and answer session at the end. So, a little bit of a background and a rationale to the reasons why that we're putting forward some proposals around change in employer representation. It's fair to say that the actual consultancy review has been helpful in considering the needs of the scheme, particularly as we move to the next phases of the scheme's journey since the closure to full benefit accrual. The trustee, in the November update, issued its long-term objective for the scheme, which is very much about working towards a position where all the remaining employers are discharged from the scheme, which is something that we all aim for ultimately in the long term. And we need to make sure that we've got the shape of the vehicle right to achieve that end outcome. What the actual consultation has identified is some areas where we can better achieve that. And the first area is to separate out the role of what's recognised as a lead employer in the scheme, which is currently held by Plumbing Pensions UK administration, and sit that firmly within full employer representation back through all employer companies. And one of the significant areas that's evolved over time is that APHC and SNPF don't represent all employers that are actually in the scheme. So it seems obvious that we probably need to go to a situation where we can bring on board all those various interests and representations to actually feed into the decision-making process around moving forward. So the proposal is very much about engaging with full and wide representation across all the employers across the scheme, and separating out the lead employer role and recognising what is an employer group as the lead employer in the process. So can we move slide, Leslie, please? So what we're proposing to do and what we'd like to propose to you is that we create a single employer company that's limited by guarantee, and the sole purpose of the company is to represent employers in relation to the plumbing pension scheme. Okay, so that's the core proposal. The proposal then is that the company will be structured and will have 6 directors on the scheme itself in terms of employer representation through this separate company. There'll be an independent professional chair to be appointed and selected. And that independent professional chair will have direct pensions expertise in DB pension schemes, which is important to bring to the party, certainly around advising, guiding and shaping the decisions around what we need to do to fall within scope of the pension regulator requirements. And in turn, help shape, guide and support the trustee in its decision-making process. So underpinning that in terms of the chair will be a couple of representatives from APHC and SNP-F. So our representation will still very much continue into this new organisation, but we'll also introduce 3 employer nominated directors that are directly appointed by the employers within the scheme. Ideally, it would be good to see a reflection of different company sizes across those nominations. That would be desirable to achieve that, but ultimately there will be a new company with 6 directors sitting on there as employer represented individuals. The proposal is that all the directors will serve a maximum period of 12 years, and perhaps significantly, the company itself will have access to its own advisors that are separate from the trustee to consider some of the scheme development proposals that are being put forward and look at them purely from an employer's perspective. And again, there are some constraints associated with that because it's always got to be within the scope of what we need to do within the scope and remit of the pensions regulations. We're looking to see the work of that independent company funded from the scheme itself. It would be logical to be able to do that. It seems to be the appropriate vehicle to be able to actually deal with that and finance and support it. Next slide, Leslie, please. So what we're aiming to do is that new employer company will broadly represent employer views in relation to the scheme. Quite challenging because the views are quite diverse. And what it will seek to do is to try and pull forward a consensus viewpoint to engage and then feed back in and support the work of the actual trustee board. So, right, what we're looking to do in particular is to support work around the 3-year evaluation that carries out, and that will particularly relate to any potential for any future employer contributions should they be needed. We've not had that situation yet. We'll look at the trustee investment strategy, and that's probably one of the areas that we really need to consider as we work together on the long-term journey plan, and that point relating to the discharge ultimately of employers. We'll look at discussing and agreeing any rule changes to the scheme, which APHC and SNP-F did previously. Those powers within the Constitution will move across to the employer company that's being set up. And then the actual company itself will communicate with employers directly to seek views and input and feedback, and also respond to any employer queries. But it's worth pointing out that the trustee will still need to communicate with employers regularly on things like individual scheme matters financially, and perhaps some questions that it needs to be raised by employers directly on scheme operation with the trustee. So that's the proposal in a nutshell in relation to the employer side of things, but it's about actually shaping and widening out representation to support the journey plan as we move forward. So at this point, I'll hand over to John Neal from Unite to cover off the Unite input.
Thank you for that, John. I'm going to speak about Unite the Union's role. So Unite has a long and proud history with the scheme, and I'm going to be talking about Unite's role in the scheme going forwards from this point onwards. If we can just move slides, thank you. So Unite's legacy trade union was previously the Electronic Telecommunications and Plumbing Union, known as the EETPU. And we helped establish the scheme back in the 1970s alongside the employer trade associations known today as APHC and SNP-F, which is already heard from. Over the years, the scheme has helped members who work in the plumbing industry save for and receive a defined benefit pension in retirement. No other national construction agreement provided a DB pension provision, At the same time, this helped employers retain the skills of their employees over the long term as workers dedicated themselves to a career in the plumbing industry. During the time the scheme was open, thanks to good stewardship and investment choices of the trustees, it has meant that the scheme has never had to make a call on employers for deficit recovery contribution payments. This puts the scheme in a unique position. The scheme closed on the 1st of July 2019, which started the scheme on a new journey where it has to deliver for the 33,000 members and beneficiaries that still rely on the scheme to provide benefits in retirement. The closure of the scheme in 2019 was the right time to assess if the governance of the scheme was still fit for purpose as the scheme embarks on its final journey. Unite, alongside the other constituents, APHC and SNPF and the trustees, have now agreed a set of recommendations for consultation from members and employers alike to reshape the governance of the scheme going forwards. Unite's long and proud history with the scheme, we believe that the job of delivering for the members and beneficiaries who rely on the scheme is only half done. Unite will continue to retain an active role in relation to the scheme, and its consent is still needed for rule amendments. Unite will also appoint 2 of the directors of the trustee company. Unite's legacy trade union helped start the scheme's journey, and Unite intends to be there to help complete it. Now, I'm going to hand over to Kate Yates to explain the administration company's role in the new structure.
Thank you, John. Well, the admin company plays an important role in the scheme. We pay members benefits, we maintain the scheme's records, we manage the scheme's assets, and we provide support services to the trustee board. And all of that will continue under the new governance structure. However, as the previous speakers have already said, there are potential conflicts built into the current setup that we're looking to change. So the trustee delegates day-to-day admin tasks to the admin company, which currently acts as the lead employer. Going forwards, the admin company will continue with the admin and support tasks, but it will no longer be the lead employer for funding and investment matters. Instead, the new employer company will take over as lead employer. And as John has said, the admin company may still write to employers from time to time, but the main point of contact for employers going forwards will be the employer company. The board of the admin company will also change, so it doesn't have the same directors as on the trustee board going forwards. Instead, it will have 3 directors made up of 2 new non-executive directors with relevant experience from the financial services sector and the CEO of the admin company. And directors for the admin company will be appointed for 4-year terms with a maximum term of 12 years. So here's a reminder to send us your feedback on the proposals. We really want to hear what you think of what we're planning to do, and kindly ask you to send us your feedback by the 14th of January. You can do that through the form on our website, and the link for you is there on that slide, or you can email us to the consultation mailbox. Now I'll hand back to John Bridger for a brief update on other important scheme matters before we open the session up for questions.
Thanks again, Kate. Before we get to Q&A, I'd just like to spend a few minutes talking about the current financial position of the scheme and Section 75 employer debts. In terms of the current financial position, there's a graph on the slide with 3 lines on it. The green line is the scheme's assets. The purple line is the scheme's technical provisions, which is the amount of money we need today in order to pay all members' pensions as and when they fall due. The yellow line is described as solvency, which is the amount of money we need today to secure all members' pensions with an insurance company. This is sometimes referred to as buyout. In this context, buyout and solvency mean the same thing. 2 things to note from this graph. Looking at the far right-hand side of the graph, this is the position at 29th of November 2021, which is the latest information we have available. First of all, the green line is in almost the same place as the purple line. This means that the scheme is currently fully funded. we have enough money to pay everyone's pensions as and when they fall due. This is very good news and means as things currently stand, we don't need to ask for employers for any more money. Even better news is that we are in this position with a very low risk investment strategy. We monitor this graph on a regular basis and carry out a formal assessment every 3 years. This is known as an actuarial valuation, and the next actuarial valuation is due in 2023. The second point to note is that although we have enough money to pay all members' pensions as and when they fall due, we currently don't have enough money to buy out all members' pensions with an insurance company. Why is buyout important? As John Thompson said earlier, when we do have enough money to buy out all members' pensions, we can wind up the scheme and all employers will be discharged. The second bullet point on this slide refers to a journey plan. This is the journey to being able to buy out benefits with an insurance company, wind up the scheme and discharge all employers. So how do we get there? How do we get from where we are now to this position? How long will it take? And what options are there, if any, to get there more quickly? The trustee board are currently considering these questions, and this will be one of the first things we will want to discuss with the new employer company. And in due course, it's also likely to be the subject of a whole webinar or even a seminar if we're allowed to gather together in a conference room. The only thing I would add at this stage is that the journey to buyout is currently expected to take a very long time. In some respects, this is a statement of the obvious, looking at the graph and the gap between the green line and the yellow line. But it's also due to a couple of specific features of the plumbing pension scheme. First of all, as I said earlier, we have a very low risk investment strategy, and so we are taking a slow and steady approach. Secondly, we have a relatively young membership. And by that, I mean that we have a lot of members who have not yet reached retirement age. And so we're looking at much longer timescales than many other pension schemes. I will take the next 2 bullet points together because they are linked. There are 3 comments I would like to make in relation to Section 75 debts and the trustees' petition to court. First of all, Section 75 debts are calculated by reference to the yellow line on the graph. That's not our choice, that's what the law says we have to do. Secondly, the law also says that we have a statutory duty to collect Section 75 debts. In order to start collecting the debts, the trustee has asked the courts for confirmation that the trustee can use the scheme assets to raise legal action to recover unpaid Section 75 debts and to defend legal action raised against the trustee. This is the trustee's petition to court, and this process is still ongoing. The latest position is that the court has appointed a court official, known as a court reporter, to review all of the information put before the court and report back to the court before the end of December. We then hope to get a final decision from the court next year, hopefully the early part of next year, but we don't know when. The final point to note is that if you think your business might be in danger of triggering a Section 75 debt due to a change of ownership or restructuring, for example, then you should talk to the plumbing pensions team about any statutory easements that might be available to you. They can't give you advice, but they can explain the options available. I'll now hand back to Kate. So I think we're ready for to take your questions.
Thanks, John. So we've set aside the rest of the session to answer your questions, and the panel will do their best to answer as many questions as we can. If you have a question, you can submit it using the question mark speech bubble at the top of your screen. We have had some questions in advance, which we'll take first. But I should point out that if your question relates to your own personal or business circumstances, then we will contact you, but outside the webinar rather than deal with it during the webinar. So the first question is for John Thompson and Fiona. Fiona, if you want to have a go first. It says, has the nomination and selection process for the independent employer nominated directors been agreed yet?
Okay, thank you, Kate. The answer to that is no. We've certainly considered what we think might happen, but we are taking advice from PI, who wrote the initial report. We'll be looking at, firstly, how we nominate to the board from the employer group, but also how we appoint on the employer company. So as John mentioned, there'll be 3 employer nominations who will sit as directors on the employer company. So we need to consider sort of a selection process for that. And the intention is that then this company will select 2 people to sit on the trustee board who will not be the same people as will sit on the employer company. So that process is being thought of very carefully so that we have as stringent a process as possible, but also make sure that we have a diverse range of representatives.
Thanks, Fiona. And following on from that, will the new structure be more expensive?
No, I mean, I think the way things were previously, employers would come to the trade bodies and would also be getting their own advice. The way things will work here, there will be a cost involved because we will be employing actuaries, lawyers, etc., to give some advice to the employer company, which will be independent to the advice received from the trustee company. And it's important to point that out. That will come at a cost, but we are restricted in how much we're able to spend. Our budget will go to the trustee on an annual basis, and some years may cost more than others depending on the activities that are being undertaken. But in terms of the value of the fund, we're looking at a very, very, very small amount, probably in less than 0.01%. So I think what we need to look at is what we're getting back from that. So as you as employers need to look at the value for money you're getting from that. And I think this certainly provides a much better option to employers.
Thanks, Fiona. And I think it's fair to say that with the new structure in place, there'll be a better decision-making process, a quicker decision-making process, and that should lead to better outcomes for both members and employers, because when there are steps that need to be taken, if you can act more quickly, you can often make savings elsewhere, whether it's better investment returns or lower costs elsewhere. Bridger, a question for you. Do you think the changes are likely to increase the likelihood that employers will need to pay deficit reduction contributions in future?
Thanks, Kate. No, I think this is, I think the point around the decision-making process will be clearer, more efficient, and both trustees and employer will be able to take advice and input into decisions reflecting their respective positions. So we should end up with the scheme that is makes better decisions, and I think that means that reduces the likelihood of employer contributions in the future.
Thanks, John. So this question's just come in now. Can we see a copy of the full report, because it's difficult to comment on the proposals without seeing all the recommendations? I guess that one's for the whole panel. Should I put that to you, John Bridger?
Yeah, I'd just like to take that away and be able to respond later. I think it probably picks up some of the comments from earlier that the PI report was the start of a process, and it needed agreement of 4 parties, and probably you won't be surprised to know that those 4 parties didn't necessarily agree with all of those sort of 50 recommendations. So there needed to be some consultation and discussion, and to come to something that was suitable for all parties.
Okay, thanks, John. the next question is probably for me because it concerns the admin company. It says, given that it's now recognised that the admin company being the lead employer is a potential conflict, what steps are you going to take to review the impact of this conflict on past decision making? I mean, we have done our best in recent years to make sure that the admin company, before it makes any decisions as the lead employer, consults fully with the trade bodies, and also has been writing out to the employers before making any decisions on investment and funding matters. And therefore we have done our best to manage the potential conflict given the structure. We're putting in place steps to reduce that potential conflict going forwards. And as John said, the scheme is in a good place from a funding perspective. So I'm not sure that we plan to make any further look back unless there were particular things that people wanted us to do on there.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add, Kate, is the lead employer is principally concerned with funding and investment matters. And I think in both those cases, the scheme is actually in a really good place, being fully funded and with a low risk investment strategy.
One's for Fiona and John Thompson. What's the selection process going to be for the new employer company directors?
I think we discussed that slightly earlier, in that that's the one that we are looking at with PI at the moment, to make sure that we have a very fair and transparent selection process and can basically look at the diverse range of members that we have. Certainly our thoughts at the moment in terms of who will sit on the employer director board, we'll be looking to have a representative from a very big company, a medium-sized one, a small company, but we will have a very, as I said, transparent. It will be laid out to all employers, and all employers will have equal opportunity to come forward and be selected. And then moving forward, this employer company would look at any nominations in future years. The same goes for the actual nominations to the trustee board. We will need to look separately at nominations from employers for that, and again have a fair and transparent way of appointment.
Great. And will the new directors receive training?
Yes, it will be important for both. Well, directors on the trustee company have always received training, but the directors on the employer company will also receive training in the same way as those on the trustee board.
Thanks, Fiona. So this next question relates to costs of the new structure. If they're expected to be immaterial in the context of the scheme's assets, does that mean that they won't impact the funding position or the journey plan?
We wouldn't expect them to affect the journey plan. They are very, very immaterial. I think, as I mentioned earlier, certainly on the employer cost, it's less than 0.01% that we're looking at the moment. So it's a very, very small amount. So I would think would be immaterial to the journey plan. And I think, as Kate mentioned, as an overall, it allows us to be more efficient in many ways as well. So that, and also new technology and things that we've all had to do during the pandemic allows us to be far more efficient than perhaps we've been able to be in the past.
Thanks, Fiona.
Yeah, I'd just underline that as well. I think, you know, the financial position of the scheme is going to be affected by investment returns, how long people live, all of those things that you'll come across when we've talked about funding before, and they are big drivers, and the costs of the new governance structure, as Fiona has said, are really immaterial in relation to those things.
That's great. So the next question relates to the terms of office. So the terms for all of the directors for the 3 different bodies in the new structure are going to be set at 4 years, renewable twice. So the maximum term would be 12 years. Is 4 years not too long?
I think if I can take that initially, Kate, from a trustee board perspective, we do an actuarial valuation every 3 years. That's, I mean, well, it's not the only thing that the trustee board is involved with, but that's quite a key key job for the trustees, and that sort of 3-year process does sort of extend probably into 4 years, because there's some work that goes on before the valuation date in terms of planning and preparing for the valuation, and the valuation itself takes 12 months to complete, with all the discussions that need to take place after it. So I think from a trustee point of view, a valuation cycle of in excess of 3 years, then 4 years would be the absolute minimum. I think that we need to have someone on the board to be able to go through that whole cycle.
And it's probably worth saying that if somebody is appointed as a director for 4 years, but then their role changes, for example, they no longer work for the employer, or they take on a different role within that employer, they can resign from their role should they wish to do so. And any new employees that come on would receive the full training. Yeah,
I mean, I'd hope that, all the trustees, whether they're appointed by the employer company or by Unite, will be there for certainly more than one term, because I think we've all said from our sort of different perspectives that there's a long time frame that we're considering here. So having trustees on for as long as possible, although we've equally got the 12-year limit as well, is important, I think.
John. So here's a question that came in advance. Are all the trustee directors going to be changing?
Shall I take that again, Kate?
John, yeah.
Yeah. No is the answer. We wanted a balance between getting new trustees on board, in some cases new professional trustees on board, but we also didn't want to lose all of the knowledge and experience around the trustee table, certainly not in one go. Well, and the other point to make is that actually, as the governance review process has gone on for the last sort of 12 months or so, there have been new people appointed to the trustee board from both the trade bodies, from SNIPEF and APHC, both of whom are actually sort of independent trustees in their own right. So we've already seen quite a bit of change to the trustee board already, which I think was all in keeping with the consultation proposals. But as we described this afternoon, there will be some more changes going forward, but not a completely new trustee board.
Okay, thanks a lot for that, John. So the next questions for the whole panel. What will happen if people disagree with some or all of the proposals? Perhaps that one to John Thompson or Fiona Hodgson first.
Well, hopefully they won't, Kate, but we'd obviously have to sit back down and review what's come back and evaluate it against the scheme, and consider modifications and change as that's part of a natural consultation process, and we want to effectively engage with people to look for the best solution to take the scheme forward.
So the next question, go on, John Pritchard.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that, I absolutely agree with what John said, was, it might be that there's a bit of a dialogue flows from that. We haven't been able to explore all of the 50 original recommendations and all of the discussions that took place under each of those headings. And it might be if there's a particular issue that a number of employers sort of raise, that we might go back and share a lot more detail, a lot more information about what the original recommendation was and what the views of the various parties were and why we arrived at the proposal that we did. I think if we did try and do that this afternoon for all 50 recommendations, we'd be here for quite a few hours, and I'm not sure anyone would thank us for that. So I can just, it's possible we might get, some more information showing, some more dialogue might flow from any feedback that we get.
Thanks, John.
If I come in as well, Kate.
Yeah, go ahead, John Neal.
The other John, just to contribute also, that very similar answer in terms of, obviously we've worked hard to come together to bring these proposals together, which we believe is a very good and balanced proposal. But there's a consultation, and we will obviously consider all thoughts of employers, members and key stakeholders to factor them in, and obviously that's the key part of that. And with the overall goal that if, when we get to that point, when the consultation responses are there and to be considered, if there's things that can add value and we can find agreement with them, then certainly from my part, we would be open-minded to considering them and factoring them in also. Thank you.
That's great. Thanks a lot, John Neal. The next question's for Fiona and John Thompson. Do you have a feel for how many of the scheme's employers are members of SNPF or APHC?
Okay, Kate, I can come in for SNPF, and I guess John can come in for APHC. We have just slightly less than 100. The numbers do change, but there's less than 100 at the moment that are members of SNPF.
And we think from an APHC perspective, there's around about 60. It's been challenging because of requirements around GDPR. So we have been trying our best to track, but we think it's around about that figure.
Yeah, so that picks up on another comment that somebody's made about GDPR and the sharing of data. They've said that the employer company will need to have the details of individual employers to allow them to properly represent them. We're obviously mindful that membership of the pension scheme is sensitive information, and we will make sure that the employer company has sufficient information to make the decisions that it needs to make on the employer's behalf. But when we run the pension scheme, we try to keep all of the employer details and all of the member details anonymous, so that any decisions are made appropriately without any undue influence, because people might form an opinion if they knew that certain employers or certain members were affected. But we will need to look at the information sharing, the data sharing policies as part of the new governance structure going forwards.
Kate, so I can just go back to the previous question that, so from what Fiona and John were saying, that's 160, I think, employers in either SNPF or APHC. What's our current employer count for this scheme as a whole? You got that figure?
It's just short of 350
Okay.
Employers, John, so just under 350.
So I guess
less than half.
Yeah, less than half, which I guess was the prompted in the reason for asking that question. Yeah. Thank you.
The consultation document that we've sent out says that the directors of the employer company, the admin company and the trustee company will be paid a market rate for their roles. A question's come in to say, will the employer board directors be paid in the same way as the trustee board directors?
Do you want me to take that one? Yeah, that was really quite important to us when we looked at the recommendations that were coming from PI, and we made clear that we did believe that the board should be treated in the same way, and that goes to training as well. So it was in the payment between the employer directors and the independent directors, and then also in the training as well. Market rate, as you would imagine, comes in slightly different for some of the independent directors, but there should be comparability between the trustee board and the employer board.
Slightly different objectives and need to meet for slightly different times and consider slightly different things. The important thing is that people will be paid a market rate for their time, and this is one of the examples where the decision was made to not follow the recommendation from the PI advisor, because they had advised that only expenses would be paid, and the group didn't feel that that was appropriate. The next question relates to the funding update that you gave, John Bridger. It comes from an employer who's had an updated estimate of their Section 75 debt, which they say hasn't changed very much, which is odd given the improvement in the pension fund. And secondly, given that it might be quite a long time before the trustee is able to completely discharge the employers, do we expect the Section 75 debts to reduce on a sliding scale over time?
Okay, on the, I guess we felt that the funding position has been in a pretty good place for certainly sort of the last few years. I think at the valuation there was a very slight or very small deficit, which you'll see from the graph as, you know, that's now disappeared and we are sort of fully funded. I think this is probably, it's probably going to be the, you know, next year when we can do a webinar or seminar or whatever it is on the journey plan, that I think we can probably get into these sort of issues around, you know, what is that time period, and you know, between now and then, what are the various sort of staging posts, and do we get there over a sort of a uniform, in a uniform way, or is it a bit more of a bumpy ride? So yeah, I think at the moment it's you know, we'll come back to that when we've worked through all the sort of questions and issue we're thinking about on the journey plan, when we've, you know, talked to the employer company about that, and then we can come out and talk to everyone about pick up those issues then, I think.
Okay, thanks, John. So we've had a couple of comments come in about the employers who are not represented by the trade bodies, SNPF or APHC, saying how were they represented throughout this process, and it would seem sensible to provide another mechanism for employers who haven't been represented by the trade bodies so far. On that, it's probably worth adding that the consultant carried out about 30 interviews with various people who over the years have expressed an interest in the day-to-day running of the pension scheme. But this consultation process is really hoping to gather views from everybody, those employers who are represented by a trade body and employers who aren't. So if you've got feedback, do send it through to us. We want to hear from everybody who's got comments. In terms of timing, does the panel is the panel able to say when the new structure is likely to be in place? And perhaps we can put that to John and Fiona first to talk about the employer company, and then to John Bridger to talk about how the trustee board might change.
Well, we're hoping, obviously dependent upon the consultation and the feedback, which is the most important process to date now. We're hoping to implement across next year. So towards the end of the year, we would like to think that it's up and operational, appointments have been made, and, you know, things are starting to be operated on in that perspective. But it is very much consultation driven, and the feedback that comes from that. If we get a green light to go without much modification, then, you know, we can get on with it pretty quickly. If we've got to look into more detail and revise some of the proposals, then it may take a little longer. Does that help?
Thanks, John.
Yeah, that's, I think from a trustee board, I guess maybe a little bit easier in the sense that we're stuck, you know, there is an existing trustee board, right, whereas the employer company, you know, that is starting from scratch. So I think in terms of the trustee board, again, subject to the points you made, John, around sort of consultation, feedback and responses, it might be sort of Q2, and so by the end of the first half of the year that the trustee board or the new trustee board is in place, but then it will take longer for the employer company, so that takes us into the second half of the year to get the employer company up and running, and then get those two two bodies, get those lines of communication open and talking to each other.
Thanks, John. So the next question is for John Neal. You've had an easy ride of it so far, so this one is for you. How will the union protect member interests in the new structure?
Thanks, Kate. Well, I think the union, in terms of protecting members' interest in any pension scheme, is normally that, you know, aligned with the duties that are on trustees anyhow, in terms of looking to you know, deliver for the beneficiaries of the scheme. But I don't see the union being any different in terms of the trustee role. Obviously, we would retain the power to nominate two Unite directors to do that, but I don't see that trustee role being any different to the employer nominated trustee directors or the independent trustee directors, because they're governed by the legislation to protect the pension scheme. So we will maintain that interest, and we're confident that all the trustees will look to do that. But in terms of our roles, I set out earlier, you know, we have a long and proud tradition and history with the scheme, and we intend to see that through for all concerned, and also, you know, as part of that and what we're discussing, balancing the employer questions and concerns with regard to the scheme, because we're not ignorant of them. We have our eyes wide open, and you know, the more we can have a new governance structure that can allow everyone to have their voice and to shape the future of the scheme, the better with regards to that. But again, also in addition, to answer the question a bit more directly as well, it would always be the aim of anyone to reach a journey plan for what is a well-funded and a good low-risk investment in the scheme, to aim to a form of buyout or some form of safe, secured pensions for the beneficiaries, which again is in everyone's interest, not least just for the members, but also for the employers to reach a discharge of their liabilities at you know, the earliest available opportunity. Thanks, Kate.
Thanks, John. So this next one, I think you might have answered through the presentation, but will the trustee directors and the employer company directors be different people? Will it be possible to sit on both boards at the same time?
I'll pick that one up, Kate. No, they are separated, so that there are no significant conflicts of interest. And I think the points that was mentioned last time were quite important, that the trustee board's responsibility is mainly to operate the scheme, and therefore the employer directors need to be appointed with that as their core aim and ambition. And the employer group then, and the employer group directors actually then feed into that process. So they are employer directors, but they are looking after the scheme assets. Thank you.
Thanks, John. We're getting to the end of the questions. There's just one left. What does the pensions regulator think about the proposed changes? John Bridger, do you want to pick that?
Yeah. I think, as I touched on, the pension regulator was keen, as I think we all were, to undertake this governance review, and we've kept them up to date as we've gone through this process, so they know what the proposals are, what we're talking to everyone about this afternoon, and they are very supportive of these proposals. So yeah, we're very pleased that we've got the support of the regulator.
Thank you. And there's just one last question that's just come in. This one's also for you, John Bridger. It's about what would happen if the court doesn't find in favour of the trustee for the petition.
Then yeah, we'll be in a position where I think the existing trustee company will need to resign, and yeah, the new trustee company will have to be appointed, and then that new trustee company will then be able to. It won't have the history. They will be able to chase any unpaid Section 75 debts. But it's likely that any claims against the old trustee company will die with the old trustee company. So it will become a new trustee company will be then free just to pursue Section 75 debts in the way that the law requires them to do so.
Okay, well that's the end of the questions that have come in. John, shall we move to the final slide?
Thank you, Kate. Thank you, everyone, for attending and participating in the webinar. Hope you enjoyed it. Hope you found it useful. I think, as Kate said, we'll try and, if there's any questions we haven't been able to address, or there's anything that's relevant to your own business, then we'll get back to you. Don't forget to send us your feedback on what we've been talking about this afternoon. By 14th of January 2022 is the consultation deadline. So you can do this on our website or by sending us an email. And if you want to re-watch some or all of this webinar, it is available on Catch Up. So they say we'll be putting a recording on the employer portal. So similarly, if you know people that weren't able to attend, they will be able to watch it in their own time through the employer portal. We'd also love your feedback on the webinar itself. Certainly from a trustee board point of view, this is the second webinar we've run. So it's very helpful to get feedback. So we'll send you a short survey in the next few days. So it'd be great if you could spend a few minutes and tell us what you think. But thank you for listening. Thank you for attending. I hope you all have a very happy and a very healthy Christmas. So thank you and goodbye.